my name is Alex Taylor, and I'm a manager at the Center for Financial Inclusion focused on data risks and opportunities, as well as projects on women's financial inclusion. As a part of Financial Inclusion Week this year, I'm really excited to have a conversation with two of my colleagues from CFI's team focused on data for inclusive fintech. We're going to be talking about how they are mapping the inclusive fintech landscape and some of the projects that they're working on to shed light on data practices and to help guide fintechs towards inclusion. So let me introduce you to Marie Valdez, who's the director of Inclusive Fintech 50, and Chrissy Martin, who is a CFI consultant working on Fintech Data Solutions. So Marie, I'd love to have you kick things off. First, can you talk about what is Inclusive Fintech 50 and some of the goals for this initiative?
Thanks, Alex. Inclusive Fintech 50 is a competition that highlights 50 early-stage inclusive fintechs. Our end goal is to elevate the focus on how fintechs can drive financial inclusion and also shed a light on the state of these inclusive fintechs. We aim to provide insights to investors and the ecosystem in general on the different innovative ways the fintechs are reaching the underserved and share observation that may drive support to the industry. This year, to provide direct value to our participants, we created the Investor Circle, which is a group of investors that will get to know the fintechs that joined Inclusive Fintech 50.
So can you tell me a little bit about how, and I know we kind of call this IF 50 too, so Inclusive Fintech 50 is also known as IF 50. How do we differentiate this from other initiatives that are also fintech awards?
Right, there are definitely other fintech awards and competitions, and there are some that are lists of fintechs. We differentiate ourselves in three ways. The first one is that we are focused on inclusivity. We are the only competition that is focused on financial inclusion. We have inclusivity as equally weighted among other three criteria, and those other criteria are traction, innovation, and scale potential. With our broader fintech work, we actually develop an inclusivity framework so that we are able to evaluate how fintechs are addressing financial inclusion. This framework looks at how solutions are addressing accessibility, affordability, and appropriateness of a product. One of our winners last year, who is fairly established and who have actually won several awards, applied to Inclusive Fintech 50 because of this distinction. The second one is that we have a robust and transparent methodology. At the start of Inclusive Fintech 50, we did a competitive analysis and we found it difficult to find what other methodologies others are using. Our selection criteria is published online, and our questions are also published online, and you could see how these questions relate to each criteria. It's also a very robust methodology where we use both qualitative and quantitative criteria. For qualitative, those are actually scored by prominent names in the industry. The last one, and definitely not the least, is that we aim to inform the industry using the data from the applicant pool. So this year, we actually added research questions on COVID-19, financial resiliency, and consumer and data protection. And of course, we aim to share these findings this year.
Great. So I know the winners will be announced soon, but they haven't been released yet for 2020. Can you give us a taste of what we should expect in the coming weeks?
Right. Well, thank you for that. Please watch out. We will announce the winners next week, and then that will be followed by a white paper and a series of digital events highlighting both the winners and also talking about the insights we learned from Inclusive Fintech 50 this year. And then on that same week, on the first week of December, we will have a series of digital events to discuss our findings and deep dive on some of the topics such as regions, the difference in each of the regions when it comes to early stage inclusive fintechs, and topics such as the digital divide and financial resiliency.
Well, we'll be looking out for that. And so, Chrissy, turning to you, Marie mentioned some of using the data from Inclusive Fintech 50 to inform the industry about what's been going on in the fintech landscape. So I know you've been working on a project thinking about how to do more dynamic analysis of this data over time. So I'd love for you to describe that initiative and some of its goals.
Great, thanks, Alex and Marie. Yes, so last year when we ran Inclusive Fintech 50 in 2018 for the first time, we got a lot more demand from investors than I think we expected, just for the data, not only on the winners, but also on the full list of applicants. So we had over 400 qualified applicants, and the investors really wanted to see all of these inclusive fintechs and get to know them. And so we saw this demand for what might be a more dynamic, ongoing data solution, and started to test and do some market research on what that might look like if we were to create such a solution. So over the last year or so, we've been doing that market research and product design to say, what would investors and fintechs want to get from such a solution? One of the things we heard loud and clear from investors was that what they want is benchmarks, so comparables. If I'm evaluating a fintech, how am I supposed to know what ag tech in Kenya is supposed to be performing at? In microfinance, we have those comparables because we have so many years of data on these companies and what their performance should be like, but we don't have that in fintech because it's relatively new, and it's also just a more dynamic space with more sectors and more business models. And so we piloted that idea of benchmarks in a report that was published in January of this year, and really tested this idea of if we create a set of data standards and define these data points in the same way, how can we create benchmarks that offer insight to the industry? We've since taken those benchmarks and used that to create investor insights for fintechs, and we're combining all of that into a prototype for a data solution as we speak.
So going back to the inclusion framework that Marie described in the IF50 competition, how does that inform the work that you're doing, Chrissy?
Great, yeah. So as we developed these data standards to inform the data solution, we also wanted to develop a way for fintechs to demonstrate that they are committed to closing the market gaps that cause the financial inclusion gap. And so we built off of what Inclusive Fintech 50 had done to say, how can we standardize a set of business solutions? So we really need a standard way to talk about these things. So it can't all be open form fields, or we can't do data analysis, right? So we standardized a set of 15 business solutions. These are based on the Catalyst Fund's AAA framework. So how are fintechs making business solutions that are more accessible, more affordable, or more appropriate than whatever is out there, right? That's how we're going to close the financial inclusion gap and deliver meaningful financial services. We also associated those business solutions with metrics such as customer retention rate or referral rates. So these are indirect indicators, proxies, if you will, for success in being an inclusive business. But what we learned from Inclusive Fintech 50 is we learned a ton about what's reportable. What kind of fintechs are willing to give data, but they don't have everything that we want in terms of robust impact data on household level income, right? But they do have data on their own business that shows the kind of traction that they are getting by offering solutions that are more accessible, more affordable, or more appropriate. And so that's the inclusion framework that we built.
Great. So I'm sure that this data that has been collected through the process sheds a lot of different light on the types of practices that fintechs are using. And I know one of the areas we're interested in at CFI is data protection and appropriate use of data. And so I was wondering if you could both speak to how the data solutions you're developing and how Inclusive Fintech 50 is bringing more light to the data practices of fintechs and helping them guide them towards more responsible finance. Marie, could you give us a little bit of background or what you're seeing in the Inclusive Fintech 50 data on this?
Just to give you a little bit. So our data shows that only 78% of our applicant pool have mechanisms for informed consent and grievance. So to me, that is really this is really a surprise because our competition is Inclusive Fintech. And so you would kind of think that the ones applying for this competition already have these things in place, right? And then since our competition is for early stage, we look at, maybe it's those that are on just the beta or MVP stage that doesn't have the mechanisms for consent and grievance. And that's not the case. We have fintechs that are in growth stage. that don't have these mechanisms. And then we again think about it again and said, okay, maybe it's those without external funding, right? Because they don't have external pressures. And so that's not also the case. 15% of fintechs with external funding answered no, that they do not have a mechanism for informed consent. This information tells us that we have more to do in terms of awareness and possibly providing support on implementing basic consumer data protection for early stage fintechs. This is the kind of data and actionable information that we would like to discover and share with the industry.
Great. And so Chrissy, from your work on piloting the data solution, what have you seen so far?
Great, thanks, Alex. Yeah, in addition to what Marie has pointed out in terms of the actual reporting data, I thought I would speak to how we are asking these questions, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge to get this type of information on what consumer protection measures are in place without going through a formal due diligence process, right? So we are relying on self-reported data from fintechs. And so when the first year of Relay, when we tested our benchmarks, we asked a lot of yes or no questions. We also want to make sure that these are accessible to very early stage fintechs, right? So we said, do you have informed consent in place or not? Yes or no. We got very high rates of yes for everything that we said. And so this year in Inclusive Fintech 50, as Moo's pointed out, we actually asked not only, if you said yes, we have informed consent in place, we asked for a screenshot, right? This helped, I think, to get some of these lower rates because it actually, forced people to back up what they said. We also asked some more challenging questions, such as, do customers have the right to port their data, right? Can I take my data with me? I think that this is more kind of cutting edge, so to speak. CGAP has done a lot of really great work on data protection in fintech that we've built these questions off of to say, we really need to be looking beyond informed consent, which we all know, right? We've all signed up for hundreds of apps where we just say yes because we want to move on. And so I think even that concept of informed consent is a prerequisite, but how can we start to think about, for example, can customers give consent at various points? So instead of just at that one point, are you asking me if you can use my data anytime that you're going to use it for something that might be sensitive? And these are some of the things that I think we want to get at more and more to start to get a more nuanced understanding of what consumer protection looks like. And based on this data set, we can also start to cut that by underserved markets, female users, right? So we found that this year in Inclusive Fintech 50, not only did we have the low rates that Marie mentioned, but when you cut by underserved users, you see that in least developed countries that you actually get even less rates of consumer protection, which is obviously disheartening. But I think this information can really start to help the industry know where to target efforts to improve this.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like this is something that can help guide investors and others in the industry to think about prioritizing different issues. I mean, we know that consumer protection has a host of issues, and just highlighting what is going on with data protection and where to focus, I think is a huge asset to the industry. And so just on that, looking ahead to 2021, how should the industry be looking at these data solutions like IF50 and this data project that you've been working on, Chrissy, to think more about how we further data protection and consumer protection? Like what other areas of focus are there, or what actions can they start taking based on these insights? And Marie, I think, could you take that one first?
Going back to the initial question on what Inclusive Fintech 50 aims to do, right? So our goal is to highlight early stage inclusive fintechs, right? We do that because we see the potential of inclusive fintechs in addressing financial inclusion. In the coming years, of course, in the process of doing that, what we have achieved in the last year is actually we brought in more stakeholders. Last year, we were able to easily invite judges, media partners, and also the investor circle itself, right? So we started, I think, with 15, and then throughout just the competition, we have other investors looking to talk to us, and actually we grew the investor circle without actively recruiting. In general, we would like the industry to look at Inclusive Fintech 50 as a platform where we all can connect in terms of what's important for the industry. in looking at thinking about our fintechs as well, our participants, for them, we see it as a direct value where impact investors are able to look at them, right? The other thing is that, maybe the most important is just like what we're talking about today, what are the market failures? And in terms of consumer data protection is that we keep our focus on this and we keep asking these questions until they are solved. And then we keep discovering and sharing information that are actionable for the industry.
And Chrissy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marie summed it up well. As we answer these same questions and continue to iterate, I think we'll just get better and better insight. So watching the change over time and also, starting to ask new questions so that we're keeping up with the industry. I think our understanding of data protection and robust, consumer data protection, especially in emerging markets, changes all the time. It's a rapidly evolving space. And I do think that collecting data over time so that we can see some of the change, both in how fintechs are adapting these standards and how the standards are changing, will really help the industry to move forward.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think being able to look at trends over time will be so valuable. And so it's great to have this conversation today to get a deeper look at these two initiatives. And thank you for participating in Financial Inclusion Week, both Chrissy and Marie. So it's been a great conversation. And then to our listeners, we hope you check back for more learnings and updates by following CFI. You can sign up for our newsletter at centerforfinancialinclusion.org. And thanks for joining us for Financial Inclusion Week.